Your host for this podcast today. It is great to be with you. We're talking about rare disease, chronic illness, and bleeding disorders. And I have a very special guest with me today, Ms. Trish Underland. I'm still getting used to it, but it's great to have you with me today. Thanks so much for joining us on the Hope Podcast. I know that I'm really excited to dive into a conversation with you today about your background. And currently, you work for Kedrion Biopharmaceutical Company, and you're a nurse educator for the hemostasis team, but you have a long journey of working with people in the hemophilia community, and super excited to talk about that. But tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in hemophilia and what you do currently with Kedrion.
So, been a nurse for a long time. Have to always preface that. Pretty much spent my career at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in pediatrics primarily, and was a pediatric nurse for 15 years or so, working in the pediatric emergency department, on the pediatric floor, things like that. I then went back to school. I got my graduate degree and became a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I really decided that I wanted to specialize. So, of course, through my experience in the emergency department and on the floor, there were, I learned a lot about different populations in chronic disease, pulmonary. We had lots of kids with asthma, renal kids, and then hematology. So it was sickle cell and hemophilia patients. I really got to know them quite well, particularly the hemophilia patients. Well, the sickle cell kids too, but because we're talking the mid-90s, when I was in the emergency room, the hemophilia kids would have to come in. There was no home treatment then. They would get injured. There was no prophylaxis. They'd get injured. They'd have to come into the emergency room. We'd get their treatment started, get their IV put in, and then they'd have to go up to the floor. Typically, for a bad joint bleed or something, they'd be, inpatient for maybe even a week of round the clock cryo infusions, and that was the only thing. So these kids that were in so frequently, so often, we certainly knew them. They would come up to triage. We'd take them right back. We knew them all by their names. We knew their brothers. And I really got to know and love that population.
Oh, it's so sweet. It feels like worlds apart from the way things are today, and so. I think for a lot of folks that have just recently been diagnosed, or even some of the guys in the community like me that have been around for a little while, I grew up in that same era where there was, treatment was not available at home, and there was so much that was limited in terms of like what our access was to, options. We didn't have options. We had, like you said, cryoprecipitate was kind of the only thing, and treatment was only available in the hospital itself. And that was really challenging times. The other thing I think that can kind of easily be glossed over was in that same time frame, not only was there no preventative treatment, but the treatment itself didn't even start to be considered until after you had kind of a fully metastasized bleed. And so you were into incredible pain, very debilitating. It was a kind of trauma that you were experiencing by the time you even came to the emergency room. I think today, a lot of times our treatment plans are kind of like, well, let's do an ultrasound and see if there is some bleeding there. Let's kind of explore, maybe I feel heat, I feel swelling, Right. But that was just life for us back then. So it was a totally different world. And I think that trauma drew us all together in a lot of ways. You got to know each other a lot better.
Yes, absolutely. Right. No, to your point, kids would get bleeds. And, the family would have to get it together to take the kid to the emergency room. So hours might go by. You get daycare or child care for your other kids. At that point, the blood's in that joint and just eating away. So it's always treat as fast as possible. But realistically, might be half a day until the kid gets in there. And by that point, pain is, unbearable.
Right.
And damage is
inevitable.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about in that timeline, you had some some challenges that came up even beyond, like, once factor starts coming around. I mean, this is a innovation of all innovations, where you're starting to see, the process of the factor itself being basically reduced down to just that very specific protein that's needed. And so we were using whole blood before, then all of a sudden cryoprecipitate came available. And then even with that, the cryoprecipitate problem, I think largely was that they couldn't produce enough of it to help the whole population. So it was very minimal. So this idea of scarcity was the way we lived, and you only could get treated if you absolutely had to. But there were some challenges that came along with the first round of factor protein that was being isolated that really introduced all of the viruses and things that were in the population. So of course, HIV took the big, billboard, if you will, but there was a lot of things. It wasn't just HIV. There was hepatitis. There was quite I can remember as a child, even all the way through college, I would still get these letters. I remember my wife and I had just been married, and we were still getting letters in the mail sometimes of like, oh, it looks like such and such disease, kind of slipped through the system. We didn't know. You might have these symptoms, whatever. And so that's running rampant through the community at the time, where all of a sudden kids start getting sick. To talk a little bit about your experience as a nurse working with these kids that were in the hospital and they're having bleeds. That's one major problem. And now all of a sudden they start getting pneumonia and other things start happening. How was that for you?
Yeah. So the terror was palpable. I don't think I can describe a worse thing, certainly in my nursing history, than experiencing that and that fear of this unknown. Now, granted, when I got into the Hemophilia Treatment Center, at this point, it was the early 2000s. So things were already getting fixed.
Right.
But the pain was still there.
Yeah.
And I certainly had some patients that I was close to that passed away because of HIV/AIDS. Undescribable. And I always, I can't imagine being a parent of a child and having to go through that. And again, even if you were lucky and your child didn't get HIV or Hep C, or just the terror of knowing that was a possibility. Just horrific.
Yeah. It was a tough time in history for sure. And we I know on the patient side of things for me, we always referred to our nurse care coordinators as, kind of our like an aunt. I mean, you guys became family to us in so many ways. It was just like, oh my gosh, Trisha's, Aunt Trish, it was like this idea, I had Aunt Karen, I had Aunt Nurse Penny, those folks for me were they were just as much a part of the fabric of my family. And I think a lot of that was because of the traumas that we experienced. And, I feel so privileged to have survived those years. And I feel like, but there's a lot of survivor's guilt, even for people that are, the parents that survived the children's passing, and even the ones who actually survived but stayed alive, but they still had comorbidities like HIV and Hep C. Even in those cases, you see a lot of folks that, had survivor's guilt just because they survived through those years and difficulty. But let's talk about, and it really, you mentioned it in the early 2000s, but even in the late 90s, we started to see really a corner being turned where some of these problems that existed in the medication at first really start to get solved. And actually, I have to say, the innovation that took place really within a 3 to 5 year period of time happened very, very, very quickly, and safety became the predominant issue that was trying to be solved. And then soon after safety was really availability, because I remember we had factor shortages and we had all these kinds of things going on. So tell me a little bit about your journey and your experience as a nurse, that you were helping these patients and these people go through this, but really they're trying to figure out how to just get access to medication, and there's fear of like, is this going to cause more problems? How did you help them cope with that? How did you help them navigate that and feel the confidence they could treat themselves and start to get access to this medication that was safe?
Yeah. Very slowly, as far as and again, the hemophilia population just got hit hands down further than any other. So, back then, even people who maybe needed a blood transfusion for a surgery, and so they were worried about it. But the hemophilia population, due to the way the factor was made and the pools and your chance of being exposed to the HIV virus, were so high. So very hard to, even though, and I know I've talked about this before. So if there is a bright side to that, it's that safety just came to the forefront. And when I learned, everything that was involved with plasma or making a plasma-derived factor product, and what, that it's starting with the screener the donor screening, and these ultra-sensitive markers that they have to detect, even not if you have the HIV virus, that you've ever been exposed. So
wow,
it was, and I got it, and it made me feel safe. Wow. But I don't have hemophilia, and I didn't have a child who had hemophilia. Right. So trying to convince, there was a wall almost that I don't want to hear it. I don't. They told us this was safe years ago. Don't tell me. So for some people, just was going to take time, and then as we are today, it's been decades now.
Right.
Since there's been any kind of viral transmission. So just having to understand that we probably weren't going to convince everybody, and we all totally understood. But we would always try to,
encourage.
Yeah.
Because the focus at this time starts, and again, we're talking about the timeline here, probably is mid to late 90s and even into the early 2000s. The idea was that safety was really a problem that had been addressed and solved. Again, the innovation that had taken place in the medical community was just fascinating and at great speed, really, in context. But at the same time, it took a great deal of empathy on your part with the patients and helping them really understand that this is safe and that this is something that is, acceptable for you to use. And then also now the focus starts to change a little bit into, can we prevent long-term joint disease? Because I think about way back. Even before the 80s, there was a timeline where really hemophilia was predominantly diagnosed by observing. They called it the crippling disease. It was diagnosed by watching you walk down the hallway. It wasn't even observed because they didn't have a blood test they could do, right? It was just like, oh, well, let's just look and see how you walk. And if we eliminate, by process of elimination, a few other diseases, like we think it's probably hemophilia. Right. And so, I think all of a sudden the mindset now shifts away from safety to how do we prevent joint disease, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
How was that?
That's a wonderful thing. Right? Yeah. That's a wonderful thing to, and then obviously it was just families that had a grandfather, and then, a grandson and some nephews or uncles in there too. That just became wider and wider as children, everybody started to think, okay, we can prevent instead of treat on demand. It was huge, and it was wonderful to see it, that was now becoming an option, and that children or adults didn't have to spend days and days in the hospital. They could do it at home, and most importantly, prevent rather than, act on a bleed after the damage has already been done. So that was an extremely exciting time.
Right.
I know as the nurse coordinator, one of my favorite things to do was, when a new baby was diagnosed and, the parents are just petrified out of their mind. They're Googling, Google around that, I guess, sorry, looking up or whatever information they could get. And they're hearing these horror stories, and they just, the most heartwarming thing was to be able to say, just listen to us. Treatment has just changed so much, and your little guy has just a really, really good chance at leading a very normal life. Wow. Fortunately, we haven't developed a pill yet.
Right.
It involves an IV stick, which most kids are not thrilled about, and many parents weren't thrilled about. but that you can have this outcome. You can have a child that, not only doesn't have to worry about viruses, HIV, Hep C, but doesn't have to worry about being crippled, having joint damage. So it was absolutely wonderful,
revolutionary, really.
That's the
because I mean, in a matter of just, I mean, it wasn't even a decade. In a matter of just a few years, it feels like there went from this, you were doomed to being crippled, to you were not doomed to being crippled. You matter of fact, you could do even some low impact sports. I mean, like things like that were just like unfathomable to us at one time. And now it's starting to realize, wait a minute, there's really hope that you could bring, a really substantial normal life, to someone. And so let's talk about the prophylaxis a little bit, because that's when really things really started to shift. And there was, oh my gosh, there's so many. I know I'm a, thick-headed man. And so I've had a very difficult time changing my mindset from treating a bleed to how could I prevent a bleed? So prophylaxis in of itself was, now that product availability is starting to come online, and now we've got manufacturers making enough product for everybody, or at least in the U.S., we have access to these products for the most part. There's now all of a sudden we're going on to this part of the journey where their prophylaxis is really it's a game changer. I mean, it's this. So, but how did you help so many people get from, I'm just treating a bleed and just being reactive to more a proactive mindset?
Well, I think definitely the little ones, we were the most successful there because the parents were for driving.
Because they had mature adults in their life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Saw and knew that if I do X, Y, and Z, my child has a wonderful chance at having a, joint damage-free life, and its quality of life is just, exponentially improved over, people that lived in a different time. So the little ones were usually easy. I mean, it was a matter of the biggest struggle was teaching parent how to self-infuse, or we at Hopkins put in a fair amount of ports.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so that was the learning curve. But, I loved it. I'd always get, see the parents 6 months into it, and they've become, proficient at infusing their child, and they're watching their child grow. And they said, I never thought I would get over this hurdle. I never thought I could stick a needle in my kid's arm. But now that I know, the future, we can do it. I guess with any chronic disease, you hit adolescence and things start to change. But I know that's with everything, diabetes, anything. Kids, their teenagers think they're invincible. I do have to say, as far as, when we would see the patients in clinic, particularly the adolescents, they would always, we talk about how's prophylaxis doing? How are your infusions? And, oh, great, just great. So you're infusing 3 times a week. What day do you infuse? And just, to kind of get them talking about it, especially if you were maybe a little suspicious that they weren't exactly following the regimen. And so I would finally say, listen, tell me what you're really doing. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Just because we did prescribe 3 times a week, we know that doesn't always happen, and it's okay to tell us the truth.
That's good.
Because the bottom line is, if you're not bleeding and you're getting by on 2 a week, we're happy. We're all happy. Our goal is for you not to bleed. Not everybody has to follow that regimen. You see, some kids are more active than others, and some kids just, they may be severes, but they just, for whatever reason, which we're still trying to maybe figure out, don't bleed as much. So you can get by on. So that's part of the partnership.
That's good.
And if you want patients, I believe, particularly adolescents, to buy in, it's got to be a team. You make decisions together. It's not the nurses and doctors are right and they know all. They're going to make the best treatment decisions, but that we think. But if it works out that 2 a week, there's one other story I always like to tell, because then going through the timeline, adults who maybe when prophylaxis came available, the damage was done. They already had bad joints. They may or may not have HIV, Hep C. So some of them were absolutely kind of apathetic. At this point, like, why am I going to start sticking myself 3 times a week? The damage is done. One of the most heartwarming stories I will never forget, we had a gentleman in his 80s, and he just was one of those just really positive people. And he was in a wheelchair. He had bad knees, bad ankles. He was in a wheelchair, but he was in his early 80s, and he was still living independently.
Wow.
And what gave him his independence is his 2 elbows and wrists were good. So he could transfer himself out of the wheelchair. So he lived in his home independently. Wow. And he said, I want prophylaxis because if these go, there goes my independence.
Wow.
And I just thought that was so, I had never thought about that, as he really could maintain his independence as long as he kept his elbows and his shoulders good. So that was just a
sweet
story that I'll never forget. And I told a lot of people that. And it's okay, maybe you do have some bad joints, but let's save the ones that you have.
Yeah, and it's just, I think sometimes this is why I love advocacy work and what we get to do as an organization, sometimes working with patients day in and day out, is that we see, sometimes the things that, might seem small to a lot of people, could be a life-changing thing for somebody in our community, and so having that experience is really amazing to be able to share with each other sometimes. Like, I can remember going to, we went to a chapter event one time when I was a teenager. I was probably about 15 or so. And I had been to a dozen of these things, and I'm just like kind of eye roll, I'm 15 at the time. And so I'm just like, I don't want to be here and blah, blah, blah. My parents made me go. We sit through this thing, and there's an older gentleman there that tells the story of a brain bleed that he had gotten, and he kept getting them. Mm-hmm. And it was happening over and over again. Now, this is kind of on the bubble of when, we're just now getting to safe treatment. So prophylaxis was not quite yet adopted broadly yet. Mm-hmm. But he's having these little brain bleeds all the time. And they were relatively, not that there's ever such a thing as a minor brain bleed, but he was having these things, and he would go in and he'd end up with, and so they couldn't figure out why he was having. Well, come to find out, he would every day when he would take a shower, he'd get out of the shower and he would shake his head to like get the water to come out of his hair, and then he would put the towel on. Well, they just kind of by process of elimination narrowed down that him doing that violent shaking in his head was actually causing these little minor, brain bleeds to start to happen. And I can remember as a 15-year-old boy sitting there listening to that going, I've never shaken my head because I did that. I was the guy doing that very thing, And so I can remember, but sharing our stories and connecting with each other is something that is it's a powerful thing that gives you this idea of like, you know what, I think prophylaxis was one of those things for me too. I started to hear the stories of people that were doing it and they were staying consistent. And that was really something that was really life-changing. I want to touch on something in this part of the journey when we're just talking about timeline too, is about portability. Mm-hmm. I mean, being able to get your infusions at home and no longer having to go to the emergency room, that was totally changed our community dynamics, right? I mean, these patients no longer had to, come into the emergency room. How was that journey for you to start to see people get this freedom that they had never had before?
Yeah, no, again, it was wonderful and a huge game changer. And I, can't, stress enough that blood in a joint is caustic. So the minute it gets in there, it's starting to do damage. So if you're going to start preventing, and you can do this, and it's in your control, you can do it. You can do it at home and keep your levels up. And, we would show them graphs. Here's your level. This is where we want you to be. And so you are preventing the damage.
It's so good.
It's
just a game changer for people. I think I talk, again, sharing stories with each other, something small for some people in the general population versus, I hesitate to say normal because, my daughter calls people that don't have hemophilia, she calls them basic. So,
I like
anyway, basic people have this, it may seem like a huge deal to have a needle stick. You mentioned IVs earlier and how difficult that can be sometimes for people to get over that hurdle. And so, but then people are like, you do that every day? And I'm like, or 3 days a week or whatever, it's like, you do that by yourself? You don't have a nurse standing over you, like doing it, administrating every time? And so, that whole concept of teaching kids, how to infuse themselves. I mean, I remember I learned at 8 years old how to self-infuse with finding a vein and getting a needle stick and, introducing this IV. So you did that with camp and the Big Stick Award and all of those things. Tell me, how was that for you, experiencing that as, a nurse trying to help care for these folks?
Oh, I loved it. I can't advocate enough for camp. And again, I'm going to, go across the board. Any chronic illness, when you have a chronic illness that's considered rare, chances are that you may or may not know anyone. You may have a cousin, you may have an uncle, you may have a grandfather, you may have a family member, but it's pretty unlikely that there's going to be somebody in your school. And then, of course, after the AIDS epidemic, and it was often kept secret anyway, because so many people did not understand that, so that was a whole nother ball of wax. But then getting these kids together for camp, and I think my experience in the emergency room and in the pediatric inpatient unit, they started to form their bonds there. They all knew each other. If one kid would get admitted, it would go through the grapevine, and that kid's going to be in there for a week. So one of their buddies, their mom would bring them over and bring them in so they could play video games together or something. So that bond between families and community was already growing.
Right.
Camp, I don't know when it started, but camp, it was just absolutely the bonds that just, you would just hear them talk, well, what do you do about this? And trading little secrets. And then, of course, the little kids watching the big kids just run into clinic and roll up their sleeve and do their infusion in 5 minutes. And I mean, I could talk until I'm blue in the face, and they don't really care what Trish says, but to watch a cool, adolescent do it, then the motivation
fosters bravery, right? When you see somebody a little older than you, that proximity of age really it plays an important role, but it really fosters that bravery, right?
Yeah. No, that was just the best. And there were a couple parents that our camp, I think you had to be, well, it depended on the camp we went to, 6 or 7-ish. And a couple, parents were like, are you kidding me? I am not going to send my kid at age 6 or 7 to an overnight camp. And I went every year. So I did always say, I will personally be there, not leaving, So that would provide a little bit of reassurance. And of course, there were physicians there, and took a couple parents a little bit longer. I know a couple parents, we did a couple camps. We did one up in New England. It was a Paul Newman camp. And then we did a couple in Virginia. And so we definitely had a little group of moms who would, we would take the kids up on a bus or to New England. We actually flew them up there, but they'd have a little caravan and they'd book themselves into a hotel, 10 minutes away from campus. Not everybody could do that, but that was what pushed a couple of them over. But then, of course, I'd always get the seasoned moms to try to coerce the newer, more afraid moms. But just the most wonderful experience. I know I went with them for at least 8 or 9 years in a row and just absolutely loved it. And the kids loved it too. And they couldn't wait to come back year after year.
I like to say that courage is contagious. Right. And so I just think being in that community environment, and that's really true at any age group. I mean, it doesn't matter what your age group, but I really do believe the staggering of those ages actually plays a really significant role. To see yourself in context of a community helps you to form the courage that you need. And I truly believe those moments like at camp are the perfect environment for that to take place. And and so important. But I believe it's important even after. We lose so many folks that are in their early 20s, just kind of disappear from the community, and that's tough, because I think in those years, a lot of times, like young married, trying to get on your feet, your first career job, you're trying to really explore what's out there. Those seasons can be very, very challenging. Unfortunately, you're so busy. I don't know how you get a lot of time going, but that's why I love doing things like this podcast or things like these online seminars where people have an opportunity to come, even where they don't have to travel, to get there, what have you. It's not cost prohibitive for most folks. But I just think it's important, though, that people get connected to somebody else that's living with the same rare disorder that they have, because that's the way that we learn, and observing by example is probably, like you said, is far better than just listening to someone tell you what to do. A lot of times you might be the most expert person at it, and but it's a lot of times you might know this off the top of your head, but I think it's something about education. They say that listening, you only retain about 20% of what you hear. You retain about 40% of what you see, and but you retain like 80% of what you experience when all of your senses are involved. And so that connection point is where it really starts to stick, right?
Yes. No, absolutely. And that's why the community events, and again, it's, don't always have to travel far, but if you can, and then it's every member of the family, right? Moms, dads, siblings, unaffected siblings. And that you talked about guilt, and that, it can go both ways. They could be,
it's true.
A sibling could actually be jealous of the affected sibling because they're getting all the attention.
Yeah. We're getting ready to do an event we do every year, an online seminar called the Family Awareness Meeting. We call it FAM for short. But yeah, that's one of the things we talk about a lot there, is that no one is unaffected.
Right.
And that's a big deal, because really and truly, our, every single person in the families, I have aunts and uncles that don't go through what I go through every day in and day out per se, but they are still just as much impacted by how hemophilia impacts me and my family relationships as sometimes even the people that live in my home are. So, I think it's important that, like you said, just to get everybody involved, get your tribe involved. Don't just come yourself, but come, get everybody to come.
Products such as Coate are derived from human plasma and adhere to strict safety protocols. In this video, we'll explain the manufacturing process for Coate. First, the plasma is collected. This is done at FDA-licensed donation centers with carefully screened healthy donors. Only plasma collected in the U.S. can be used to manufacture products available in the U.S. The next step is viral testing in two different ways. First is serology. Serology can detect markers that indicate whether a donor has been in contact with a virus that could be passed on to others. Next is NAT, or nucleic acid amplification testing. This is a very sensitive test that can detect very low levels of viruses in plasma. NAT is so sensitive it is like finding a needle in a haystack. Only plasma that is virus-free is used in manufacturing. Thousands of plasma donations are combined into a large pool, and then a second round of NAT testing is done. Fractionation is the next step. This separates all of the different proteins in the plasma until only the protein you want, in this case, factor VIII, can be collected. Finally, the collected factor VIII is treated with solvent and detergent, which is like a chemical wash. The solvent and detergent are removed. And then the factor VIII is treated with dry heat for 72 hours. These two steps work to inactivate or eliminate any viruses that may remain. There have been 0 documented cases of viral transmission associated with Coate's current manufacturing process. It's important to keep in mind that because Coate is made from human blood, it carries a risk of transmitting infectious agents, such as viruses, the agent of the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or unknown infectious agents. Kedrion is a proud manufacturer of plasma-derived products that keep life flowing. We want to thank all of our donors for their gift of life-saving plasma.
Yeah, there's nothing sadder to me, to think that, there's some child or teen, whatever, out there who truly doesn't know anyone else who has hemophilia and doesn't have that support. It just makes all the difference in the world.
It really does.
To have that community, family support, and it
really does. I often refer to my family growing up. I have a lot of family in rural Alabama, and there's this, it's like a small town, and everybody knows everybody, And I've often said that the hemophilia community is kind of like that. It's that Mayberry sort of thing, but it's just spread out over a huge amount of geography, but it's a very small community. And once you get involved, you start to see people that you know or that you've seen online or that people that you connect in different ways. And those moments are so great because it's kind of like a small town. It's just in a really spread out, fashion. And so, I think it's important that we do connect. And so some of the dynamics are the same. You get people gossip and people talk about,
oh yeah,
Mom, I know what your mama said, and all that happens, but at the same time, at the end of the day, it fosters. I always tell people, community alone is not the answer. Healthy community is. And so there's a sense of like, how do we foster a family atmosphere? And you know what? That takes all of us contributing to it, every single person. And so you're doing a lot of that now. You're traveling around and speaking at events. You're doing it as in your role as a nurse educator now with kids around. You've been doing that for a little while. When you left Johns Hopkins, you actually went to work in as an educator, right? Mm-hmm. Shortly after that. And so you've been kind of doing that for a while now, right?
Yeah. And that was a nice try. Like I said, I've been a nurse for a long time, and it was a nice bridge to kind of continue to connect with the patients that I knew and meet new patients and new family across the country. And then everything has changed, and there's so many treatment options, which is wonderful. Yeah. It's absolutely wonderful. I think there's a good fit for everybody now. And but it is still important to maintain that strong community and support and togetherness to help even help each other decide what therapy is best for them. It's wonderful that they have a lot of choices. And those days I think of worrying about transmittable infectious diseases are, I think, over. I mean, it's mostly over. Sure. It's going to be in the back of everybody's mind. But products are safe, and there's a lot of choice. Yeah. But the community will always need the support of each other and to continue to advocate for safety.
Yeah.
And
I want to talk about that a little bit because, one of the things that's near and dear to my heart and something that I love to talk a lot about is patient choice specifically. And we've actually seen some actions taking place by, insurance companies and different formularies that are being used now and really an effort to try to limit choice. And I think that that's really a negative thing for all of us, is that we need to maintain choice whenever possible. There's a lot of argument to be made for cost effectiveness and things like that, but I do believe that at the end of the day, something that I have concerns about in our community is that I don't get the impression that patient education is quite as prevalent as what it was when there was so much trauma in our environment. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that now people are just there's so many choices that you just don't know what to choose. And so people just decide to go with whatever is the predominant recommendation, which may or may not be the best thing for you.
Absolutely.
I think you need to be self-empowered. You need to educate yourself. And so I tell people this all the time. You need to study what works for you. You need to know what options are out there so that you can know and have an educated conversation with your provider. Yeah. And I know that's something that you fostered throughout your whole career. So tell me a little bit about how do you think that patients should be educated about their products and what works for them? Because it's not always about what products exist. Sometimes it's about what products exist, but also what works within your biochemistry, right?
Right. No, absolutely. And And I think there was obviously a lot of things have changed, including the Hemophilia Treatment Center's funding.
Right.
The funding has gone away, or not completely, but
It's different.
it's very different. I do think that, coupled with the fact that there are so many treatments, do I think when a patient comes in for their annual, HTC visit, there's going to be this massive conversation about all the products that are available? No, that's completely unrealistic. So that's not going to happen. How do we fix that? To your point, part of it is up to the patient to learn what's out there. And I do think that happens probably within families. Certainly, Joey started on this and he's doing great, so now we want to put Billy on it. I guess I'm a little old school in that whatever treatment you're on, if you're able to do it and it's working, able to do it, meaning you're getting enough infusions or, it's not such an arduous bleed, right? You're preventing bleeds. So I'm always, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Yeah. But then there's also maybe the side of, okay, we are doing this regimen and it's working, we're preventing bleeds, but if there's an option that's easier and makes my quality of life even better, understood. Yeah. And if that option is there and available, but yes, unfortunately, I do think a lot of times the patient does have to drive it. And again, I'm speaking, when I left Hopkins, there 18, 20 treatments available now. Right. We could, and we did go over most of the, and they were all pretty much the same. It was plasma-derived versus recombinant versus extended half-life recombinant. Now there's a whole host of others. So, and again, it's everybody's different. And so.
How do you feel about patients changing? At one time there was quite a bit of discussion about if I change products too often, it might. There's a theory that some people thought that it might cause things like inhibitors. Now, the SIPET study kind of did away with that and helped us understand that there's probably some other elements going on there. Matter of fact, recombinant products was one of the things that kind of was highlighted as potentially a problem for causing those things. Not that I think in the hemophilia community, as patients, we're all a little closet scientists, but I'm not a professional in that field, but at the same time, I think that was clear that, that changing products was not the thing that drove that. And so how do you feel about somebody, like if it's not working and they're not satisfied, trying something different?
Absolutely. If it's not working, then it's not working. And I know from a science and perspective that I think that has been put to rest.
Yes.
In the beginning, I have to admit, to me, it made sense intuitively.
Sure.
If you're throwing different things at the body and then you get an inhibitor, it's almost like, well, duh, you kept throwing all these different things. So the body doesn't know what's foreign. And so, but that has been put to rest. I guess probably my biggest pet peeve when I was at the HTC were when patients wanted to change products because somebody had a new fancy reconstitution device and theirs was cooler.
Right.
And that used to make me nuts. It's like, is your product working okay? Yes, you're not having bleeds. Is it that difficult to do that? Yeah. No, but this one's cooler. Then I would say, again, the bottom line is a
TV screen in the mail and it showed me a neat little commercial and I was like,
so
wow.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, at Hopkins, we were definitely, it was the patient's choice.
Yeah.
It didn't mean that if somebody told us that they wanted to switch because they thought that we didn't have a pretty long conversation about what you're putting in your vein right now is really doing a nice job, and that mixing device may not be as cool as the new one, but it's pretty easy.
But correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm gonna push a little here, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think patient rights is something that is not often valued enough among the population, and I think the best, while the physician is the most expert at everything that they're recommending, and they're the professional and the nurse is the professional, I think that that at the end of the day, we're the ones injecting it into our bloodstream. And at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to have to live with the consequences of what we do or don't do. We're the ones who have to really make that decision ultimately. The professional is the guide and the coach, and should be there as a supporting role. And they're the best chance we have at the supporting role. Like I depend entirely on the advice that I get from the professionals I'm alive today because I've taken advice from it. So I'm not downplaying that, but at the same time, I want to make certain that, it's understood. I think if we understood as patients, the role that we play is very significant in choosing the course for our own treatment plan.
I could not agree more. Absolutely. And I do have to say, moving out of this role, leaving Hopkins, I know how we were, and that was the exact scenario that I described. The bottom line, when the day was done, if that patient, that it was that patient's choice for that exact reason that's going into their body. We can recommend, we can support, we can educate, but when the day is done, it was their choice. I think moving into this different role where I want to be politically correct here. I know that, okay. I don't know that all HTCs or maybe not just hematologists or providers maybe don't always think that way and just believe because they've got the science, so right, we can never stop telling patients to use their voice. It is their body and it is their choice, and that's what we hear a lot. Patient choice, whether it be specialty pharmacy, whether it be and yes, insurance unfortunately dictates that. That's a bigger hurdle, I think, to me.
Let me push back on that too, because I don't think they have to.
Okay.
If patients understood the power that we have collectively,
Yes.
I believe we could change even the formularies that are being used. See, I think we sort of assume that insurance companies dictate, but we don't realize the power we have.
Yeah.
If we stood up and spoke up collectively, we could change things. We have before, and we can again. This is something that I'm very, very, very supportive of and passionate about when it comes to PBM reform right now, and a lot of things that are going on with these restrictions of these networks and all kinds of things. We have patients right now that are having to choose between whether or not I need to go to my HTC and see my physician of choice, or if I'm going to get the drug I need or the drug that I'm taking. And I have to choose an insurance policy that does one or the other, but I can't get access to both. That should not be.
No, of course
And we
not.
can advocate to make change there. I don't think that we're unified enough to do that, and that's really a sad thing to me. I hope that we can improve that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there, and I do have to say, just from the provider's perspective, if there was pushback from an insurance company about a certain drug, we had to just jump through every single hoop, and it took time, but usually at the end we did win.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of having the time, the persistence, and then it's, to your point, the unity to say, if we all get together and do this, we'll get the outcome that we want. So I do think you're right. But I think a lot of times the insurance companies just bank on the fact that a lot of people don't have it together, or the perseverance, whatever, to jump through every single hoop, because it was a rare occasion where at the end we didn't get what the patient wanted, or when we were advocating for the patient.
That's true. And if we allow, as a community, and I say we because I believe it's our ownership that changes things, if we allow that, even the pressure of our providers and the support staff and everybody to have to really write a 72-page essay as to the reason why, if we allow that to be still the thing that tips the scale, even in that, it could be the thing that could eventually they'll continue to tighten the reins into where even those privileges from providers won't be allowed anymore, because they'll say that they're formulators. This is an issue that we're working on with Congress right now to try to get some of these things untangled. And I believe that there's a huge need for major reform to be made when it comes to the way that these companies make insurance formulary decisions, and even the medical boards that they use a lot of times are very biased, and we have to stand together to do that. We cannot do that alone. We have to do it together. And I'm very passionate about it, but I think that I'll say another aspect of this idea of choice. So I mean, it's a big deal, right? There's a lot of things we talk about with this, but you kind of alluded to it. I like to say it this way, is that all providers are not created equal. So, that's not a knock on anybody,
right? But
at the end of the day, like, if you don't connect with your providers, like if you go in and you're just not clicking, it's like you don't feel like there is healthy communication. Try again. I mean, go get a second opinion.
Right.
We have on our board of directors, we have a physician that he always says, go get a second opinion, go get a third opinion, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh opinion if you need it, because sometimes it's that continuation of seeking the not just the correct answers, but also the way in which you're able to flow information back and forth, and sharing your concerns and sharing your needs and being heard and that being facilitated, and even finding the group. And of course, you guys were just so stellar, over the top, great about making those 72-page essays to defend those rights. But not every provider does. And I would say probably 50-50. I mean, I might be, overshooting there a little bit, but I think I don't think that's terribly overstated to say that half the time you get, providers that are willing to fight for you for what your needs are and make those additional exceptional, pleas with the insurance company. And sometimes you just don't. And sometimes it depends on what they're asking for, because if it's access to their treatment center, it might be, but if it's access to a medication that they are asking for, it might not be. So, you just have to keep working with the people that you are choosing, and recognize as a patient, this is your choice, right?
Yes, it's right. Empowering the patient. It is not, let's face it, not everybody is sophisticated enough to be able to navigate that and advocate for themselves. It's true. I'm going to say it's probably more the exception.
Well, again, I would push back on that too. And I would just say that I think that most people are far more sophisticated than what they give themselves credit.
Okay. Yep.
I do. I think most people have more power in of themselves than what they recognize they do. And so really, I think where the rubber meets the road is, as a patient, we just have to believe the right way in order to get better results. I mean, if we could just change our thinking a little bit, it could literally change our trajectory for a lifetime.
Absolutely. Would not argue.
Your life has been a reflection of that, in the way that you've treated your patients, and also the way that you've done that. I know I've heard you talk about that in presentations before, and that's one of the things I love so much about your passion for the community. And I think it's super important. I do want to touch a little bit on product, because, it's interesting. Kedrion has a plasma-derived product, and there's been a lot of discussion in years past about, that's kind of a, legacy product. Is that something that I should still consider? And I think we're starting to see more and more patients that are starting to go and say, you know what, I've looked at plasma, I looked at the SIPET study, I started to realize maybe I need to revisit some of these things. We have a lot of guys in the community that have just been on it for a long time. They're like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so, but we also have other folks that are going, I tried these things and I'm going back to this because I feel like this is actually something that's more stable, or it fits better within my lifestyle, or it's something that and one of the things I continually hear about is that, when I was growing up, we didn't have nearly the inhibitor population that we did later on. Once recombinant became a predominant, platform. And so, again, all recombinants are not created equal. So I think you just need to do your homework. You need to know what it is that you're needing. We've seen a lot of people who did have inhibitors that actually tolerized on products like what Kedrion has. So I'm excited to know a little bit about your feelings about, where does plasma-derived product fit in the marketplace today?
Well, I do absolutely think it has a place. It's not for everyone, but it's certainly, and again, my experience mostly comes from the older adults at the HTC. They're on a plasma-derived product. Recombinant products come out, and everybody says, "Oh, we should you should switch, go on this recombinant product. And I just definitely had more than one, had several that went ahead and switched. And then a couple months later, called me up and said, you know what, I think the other stuff worked better. It seemed like it was more typically on-demand patients, because what I would hear is, my old product, my plasma-derived product, one dose, one and done, where the newer, and again, completely anecdotal. I don't have anything to back that up, but it happened, several times, and they just
back on.
hurt. Yeah. And so I just, it's they know their bodies, they could feel it, they felt the bleed is resolving quicker, whereas with other products, maybe they needed to do another dose, and they just felt like they got resolution quicker. These were, again, a lot of them were people that weren't going to do prophylaxis for whatever reason, but on demand. And again, it was the old, well, how many times are you infusing with bleeds? Oh, twice. Why don't you just do it prophylactically? But some people we convinced.
Doing it anyway, but they just didn't want to call it that.
Yeah.
I'd be giving in.
Yeah, exactly. But so, yeah, absolutely. And then again, with the SIPET trial, it's, I'm sure we'll get even more data. But again, from an intuitive perspective, it feels like the plasma-derived, I can understand why it seems like there would be less inhibitors, and I could see how it worked. It's just closer to your, endogenous
That's right. I've heard some people say that it's more organic. I don't know about that, but
yeah,
it's about the same way that the Oreo packet says on the shelf at Walmart. But no, but I mean, there is something to be said for that. It's human. It's recognized by your body already. There's maybe not as many red flags that go off. But I do think that we are starting to hear. Actually, it's been interesting because I just in the last couple of years, we've started to hear new families that are first diagnosed that are starting to go and say, you know what, we looked at all the products, and this is kind of, we want to start with plasma derived.
Uh-huh.
And some of it was off of the data that came out from the SIPET study. But I do think that there is, still a lot to be said for, the safety that is going on. I mean, once you really dive into the weeds of and you brought up a great point earlier about how it's not just a matter of did the donor have, exposure? It's like, did someone in their family have? I mean, they can go so far back before they ever even introduce that into the system. And so the safety has been there for really decades now, like you've said, and it's not, I don't think those are concerns like we once upon a time had. And at the same time, I think, it goes back to what is it that you feel like works the best for you and your body. And if you're not getting the results you think are possible, this is one of the reasons why I really encourage people to do their research, because if you go out and look at, and again, some people are afraid of this because they think, well, I'm not the expert. I wasn't trained in science to know all this stuff. That's okay. Try to absorb as much as you can, because I do think we're capable of being a lot stronger mentally than we think we are. So challenge yourself. Go back and read some of the ways that these things are put together and these things are designed. And you might just find that you'll learn some things along the way about how it's designed, but you start to learn some of the ideas of this one is pegylated and this one has got albumin. Am I saying that wrong? And there's there's all these different ways that these things are done. Well, probably purest form of just factor protein is very simple. It was innovative, from coming from cryo. But when we go back to it now, it's like, man, you want something that's just the very thing you're missing. This is probably something that people should at least be aware of. Mm-hmm. And if you're not getting the results that you think are possible, you might want to try other things. And I think that's something that needs to be on the onus of the individual person to do their own research and to explore what those options are, and then have a conversation with your provider, right? Because you got to go back and say, okay, listen, my doctor knows my work, my history. My doctor understands what all these they understand the science and they understand the studies. And so let's go have that conversation with them and then come to a conclusion together, right?
Right. I guess maybe a little bit along those lines, there was, in the beginning, we didn't do a ton of PK testing, right? We would check levels. We would do a 24-hour level, but not a full-blown PK study. But then when there were so many more therapies, we would push to say, come on, let's just get this documented. What's the half-life look like in you, and definitely the older patients. But I don't care about that. If you want to do it. But I know this product works, and it is, but it was always nice when the numbers matched, and it's like, you know what, actually, you have a really nice half-life with this product, and so all right, well, that's what I said. So now you got your numbers, you can be happy.
That's so good. I'm so glad you brought that up, because this conversation would not be complete without talking about PK study, because the perikinesis study idea is that you see, I think for maybe people who are listening and don't know what that is that we've moved away from it, I think, in recent history, but I do think that it's incredibly important because it can help you to show your peaks and your trough levels of how the medication is actually working in your system. I don't think a lot of people, and if you've been in hemophilia for a while and you've had a PK study done before, you might be familiar with this, but people do this even outside. Like they look at, I've heard pain management doctors talking about how they can actually measure the effectiveness of pain medication or NSAIDs or different types of things. They can actually see how it metabolizes in your system. So I actually heard a research scientist say one time that things examined in isolation are incomplete because nothing is actually introduced into our biochemistry in isolation.
Okay.
Which I thought was an interesting...
Fair point.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, because really, once you introduce it into your biochemistry, now all of a sudden it becomes part of your ecosystem.
Right.
And your human ecosystem can use it one way or another that's very different from the guy sitting next to me. So that's why even in some families, we have like 2 or 3 people that have the diagnosis of hemophilia in their family, but you've got sometimes 2 or 3 different kids that are using 2 or 3 different products because one works really good for this one. It doesn't work the same for the other one. And it's all because our biochemistry is extraordinarily complex. And you introduce that into here, it might be one way or another, but the perikinesis study really helps us to be able to see what is that activity and how is your body reading it, and at what level does it really have its most effectiveness, how its least effectiveness. Right. And I think half-life is kind of an overused term. People like kind of rattle it off all the time, but people don't really understand what that means. And so to start to realize, well, if you're getting an infusion and your prophylaxis dose is only, I mean, we hear people sometimes that certain providers recommend 35% or 40% action for their prophylaxis dose. Well, okay, but are you having microbleeding?
Yeah, right.
2-3 days later, and they're, well, I'm on a product that's long lasting. Okay, well, great.
Right.
But you took it on Monday and now on Thursday you're having inflammation? Is that causing damage? Could be.
Right.
And so, what if you just took every other day and maybe you didn't have, or we have patients that have had trauma that are using a long-acting product that we hear, again, this is anecdotally, I'm not a scientist here, but we hear sometimes that the infusion doesn't always necessarily respond immediately because it feels like it's trying to stretch it out over a long time. So the feeling that you're experiencing in your body plays an important role in your decision-making. And again, I would just recommend that people really just have these conversations with their provider. And I think people are scared to, because, it's something that is terrifying. But, I know that you're a big fan of the PK study because it really helped your patients be able to quantify. But what would you say to a patient who might be listening to this and going I just don't feel like I know enough to ask. I do feel like I am having some trouble, but I have white coat syndrome and I don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers or offend my physicians or my nurse care coordinator. What would you say to them that may be afraid to do that? Should they ask, or should they just kind of go with what?
They should absolutely ask. And I know that, we would graph it for them. And, along those lines too, I'm going to say I know what was changing as I was leaving Hopkins. The goal initially of prophylaxis was to make you your trough. So at your lowest time, you're more of a moderate. And then over time, I definitely had people say, no, my kid's too active. If their trough is 3% and they're out there, that's too low.
Right.
We want to go higher.
Right.
And then you, again, back to the pushback from insurance companies saying, wait a minute, why are you giving so much? This isn't a normal prophylaxis dose. And it's like, well, this is a 7-year-old kid who's tearing it up on the soccer field, and we want a higher trough. So just to see it, and even, definitely for parents and adults, are going to see that, recognize what, and again, adult weekend warrior, they're out doing, so they need a higher trough. So it enables you to personalize getting a PK testing. It absolutely will, can help guide treatment. And I know that was definitely changing. The troughs were getting higher, and it's a mild, going down to a trough of 2 or 3% is probably fine if you're a sedentary person, but if you're a young kid, probably not, or an active adult. So absolutely.
Well, and if you have surgery, I mean, this is, God forbid, I hope no one has to have surgery in our community, but the reality is that your kids might have to have their wisdom teeth removed, or the reality is that you might have to have a port put in or a port taken out. I mean, you use your port in 5 years, but at some point that port's got to come out. So, these types of things, I would never have a surgery without knowing my PK study beforehand.
Absolutely.
Because knowing what those peaks and troughs are will have a direct correlation to how you'll bleed. And I'll take this from experience. I've done so many PK studies over the years that one of the things that we found was that when I was in pain, I metabolized more quickly.
Absolutely.
So my troughs would be trailing off way faster if I was, I'll this is just, I don't, divulge all my details sometimes, but I'll tell, this is a personal side of my story. I was on a recombinant product that had a really cool transfer device. and so I was a teenager and I was on that product for about 15 years. Well, in that timeline, I went from having a normal 12-hour half-life or so to where I went all the way. I just kept having like little, and at the time, in this timeline, the doctors continually were saying, well, you're just having inflammation. I would say, I'm having swelling. It's hot. I can't walk on it for some days. Like, it's just arthritis. You just have joint damage, just arthritis. And they really said that a lot. My doctor many years later came back to me and said, Jonathan, I'm really sorry. Actually, we've now discovered with all the data that any inflammation or fluid in the joint causes damage. So, sometimes what we feel in our bodies, and call it anecdote if you want to, but sometimes we're on the front lines of feeling it in a way that a person without a bleeding disorder, not living with it, just doesn't feel it. It's not the same. And so, but knowing those peaks and troughs was really important because I went all the way down on this particular recombinant product. Went from a 12-hour half-life, and over those 15 years, it continually went down to where I was at a 4-hour half-life.
Wow.
I had no high titer level. I had no antibody response. I didn't have an inhibitor, but all my inhibitor friends would look at me and go, you're infusing more than we are. And we infuse a lot. I mean, and so, they were saying like, how is it that you don't have an inhibitor? And they would do the studies and I wouldn't have an antibody response at all. But my effectiveness of my product had dwindled down over years. So I just think sometimes you can live with pain so long and build up a higher and higher tolerance because we're created in such a way where, man, we can adapt, right?
Right.
And so that pain tolerance just increases while our our bleeding is, while maybe the effectiveness of the product is decreasing.
Right.
And I just, man, looking back on that, I wish I would not have lived 15 years with that problem. I wish in 7 years, I wish in 5 years, within 3 years, whatever. If it wasn't working, I wish I would have chosen a different path. Now, at the time, again, the predominant line of thinking in the medical community was, well, you don't want to change because it could cause maybe, an inhibitor or something. But obviously that's been debunked since then. And again, that's another area that I have had, the medical community come back and apologize a handful of times. Matter of fact, I can count on 4 occasions where they came back and said, look, we were giving you this advice at one time and we realized that, but they're always going to realize it in the rearview mirror. That's no fault of anybody's. Sure. That's no fault of anybody's. But you have to understand that research is always backwards looking.
Yes. Yeah.
And so in a patient experience, we are always in the moment. We're very current. We're very right now. And so we feel it. We get it. We're experiencing it. And you should never, I don't think people should ever downplay the value of their lived experience.
Absolutely.
My grandfather, one of the quotes that he used to give all the time, I loved it so much, was, he said, a man with experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. And I just think that when you have experience, you can give me all the information you want to give me, but if this is what I'm experiencing, I need to be confident in this is my reality. I need to be honest with myself. And then that way I can go to my physicians and I can be truly honest with them too, because the more I start to be a squeaky wheel there, the more they might say, well, let's experiment. Let's try a few things. So maybe we should try something different. Maybe we should try this approach or that approach. Maybe we should increase frequency. Maybe we should increase units. Maybe we should try to play with these numbers. Maybe we should do another PK study to see if your metabolization has changed, right?
Right. And to your point, we're always learning. We're always getting more data. We're always learning. Did this have to do with you going through puberty, hormones? I mean, it's dramatic in the von Willebrand disease world, especially with females.
Right.
And changes in estrogen and going through puberty, things completely change. So is there something to do with that metabolism and factor? And then on the flip side, one of my other favorite, I had a guy in his 90s, and he with aging metabolized everything so much slower. So he'd had a pretty bad joint bleed, and he came in. It was one of those things that his last dose of factor, and then he came to just for a follow up, but he was done, and his baseline was 4% or something. He came in a week later, and his factor level was like 8 or 9, and we're like, we're still holding on to that. And it was one of the first. I mean, he was hands down our oldest patient, and we're like, that's really nice. Your half life is like 20 hours now.
Hours long.
So, those are all those things that we don't know yet, right? Because we don't have enough data, and we haven't. But I always think that puberty gets things pretty wacky.
Oh yeah.
And it's definitely something I think you have to think about. But again, to your point, that's the science and the data, and they are always looking, it was something, you knew something was different. Did you know what was causing it? Probably not. You just knew something was different.
That's right. And I would say too that one of the things that's super important for people to understand is that getting more information. I love what you said at the beginning. You were talking about, tell me what you're really doing, and then we can address on finding a solution, because I think sometimes in that exchange, like sometimes we're afraid to be, I know this may sound crazy, but I think as patients, sometimes we're afraid to be honest.
Yeah.
Because we really in some things, if things are working, we don't want anything to change.
Uh-huh.
So we're like, no, everything's great. Everything's great. Everything's great.
All right.
But getting more information, such as a PK study, can really help everyone involved. It can help you understand what you need to change. It can help your providers understand what needs to change. But if nothing else, it just can also, like you said, affirm what you know to be already true. So if you're having a hard time communicating that, sometimes a test like that can really help. And it's a series of tests. Sometimes it takes time.
Yeah, it can be tough.
Yeah, but I would say too that there's a lot on the unknown side that we still don't know. I'm always fascinated by how much we know. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me how much. I've had the privilege of actually going into some of these labs that do some of the work on these products, and it is amazing to me how many intricacies that we understand. But it's actually equally as fascinating to me of how many intricacies we don't understand.
Right.
And so while I love focusing on what we know, I also have to hold that in balance with what is it that we don't, what are the questions we aren't asking yet? And case in point was there's this great study that was done a number of years ago in lab rats where they added additional factor 8 to these lab rats, and they found that it had a change to their bone density. So how much of factor being in our system plays a role in bone density?
Absolutely.
Your gut biome, it actually plays a role in your digestive system. So there's all kinds of things. Your teeth, we don't know. There's so many things that we don't know yet. And so I like to try to ask myself these questions of what is it that I hear what's in the study. I read the SIPET study. I'm thinking, okay, I have that now as a baseline. I could kind of go, okay, this is kind of interesting, but what are the questions that are not in there? What are the questions we haven't asked yet? And that could drive you mad if you're, but so I don't mean to, but I don't stay up at night thinking about this too much. But I do think it's interesting to keep that in perspective.
Absolutely.
I think for all of us, because we're all after the same goal, and that is to have a long life, a healthy life, and a child that can be able to thrive and not think about their disorder, right?
Absolutely.
It's all about thriving ultimately. And so thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you for what you do in our community currently with just all of the education that you're providing to the community is just so needed. And thank you so much for being here with us on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure. Thanks.
You're welcome.